Thank you. So welcome back, Mike. We've got a new version of S124 reflecting a couple of minor changes that we made yesterday to the first half of the bill, and maybe you could just point those out.
So the first is on page 4, lines 15 and 16. Remember how the MOU between the two agencies is being struck, repealed, however you want to refer to it, and in its place there's a document that's going to outline the roles of the two agencies. Well, there was still a reference to the MOU in the bill, and so that was struck. The reference is specifically in relation to the performance measures that the two agencies have to report each year to the General Assembly. And so it'll just say regarding the success of each agency in meeting its selected performance measures. And above there, you see where they have to report their selected performance measures. The next change is on page 16.
The emergency threading.
Yep. So this is in section 5 relating to the seasonal application of manure and the authority of the secretary to issue an emergency exemption. Remember, there's 2 exemptions. There's the emergency exemption just when there's structural failure or other exigent circumstance. And then there's the seasonal exemption, which you can see the criteria for at the bottom of page 16 going on to 17. But there's no criteria in the language right now about the emergency exemption. There is in the rule. So the agency wanted to recognize in statute that there is the emergency exemption. But when they did so, there were questions about what are the criteria for issuing it. So it will now say, or as authorized under an emergency exemption granted by the secretary according to criteria set forth under the required agricultural practices. And it's there. It's not like the most detailed criteria, but there's a standard. And so people will be able to look and refer to it.
All right. So that I think is exactly what we talked about yesterday and hopefully satisfies any concerns.
I did make 2 other changes. I was confirming all the cross references in the bill. And I found 2 cross references that were just like way off. And so they were changed on page 21, lines 1 and 2. They were like, it was like subdivision 27 and subdivision 30. And I'm like, what? How the hell?
Good catch.
So
could we go back to page 18 in this draft and just go through, and I think we can probably do this at a faster pace than we did yesterday on the Title VI sections. But so we have a long series of definitions here. And then there's information on the CAFO implementation. And then there's the stakeholder group, the establishment of the stakeholder group, and the timing. We've had several conversations about the definition of waters. So maybe as we're going through this fairly quickly, we can just stop it when we get to that definition, and anything else that you think we want to be sure that we're all clear on. And if anybody has questions at any point, we can stop.
Well, the definition of waters is on page 19, so you can stop right there.
Okay.
The question is, do you want to limit jurisdiction of the CAFO program to the federal definition of waters of the United States, or do you want it to be broader and apply to waters of the state? The Federal Clean Water Act only requires it to apply to waters of the United States, but a state has the policy decision to make it broader in scope. So the question really becomes one for you you obviously have to meet the federal dictate of waters of the United States, any potential discharge or actual discharges from a large CAFO or medium CAFO into a water of the United States. But do you want it to be broader than that? And that's a policy decision.
So let's just, let me just take maybe a show of hands straw poll. Who is okay with the existing language as is, which uses waters of the state in this context here? Okay, all right. Then I think let's go forward then, yeah. Before we literally go forward, Mike, we had separate testimony yesterday from a witness who raised a concern about spreading on ag land. This is going off the subject slightly, but I want to mention it because there's some other definitions here that are maybe apropos about the spreading on ag land of the byproduct from dairy processing plants. And I think it's way, maybe primarily, concern was raised. And I'm wondering whether any of the definitions that are listed here include that product.
No, they don't.
I'm looking at waste. You've got waste up there, and then there's also pollutants.
So that application of material, so let me just step back. Your milk house waste can be put into your manure pit and then managed as your manure is managed. But if it goes to dairy processing and it goes through whatever process the processing plant is using, there's a potential for additives to be in it and the potential for pathogens to be in it. And generally, the Agency of Natural Resources issues that permit for the land application of that material. Cabot, in Cabot, at their plant in Cabot, they didn't have sufficient wastewater capacity to deal with their effluent. And so they were dealing with some of it through a land application permit. And that's through A&R.
That's not related at all to anything in this bill.
It's not that it's not related at all. Like farmers dump milk, right? And if they have excess milk, they're allowed to dump their milk on their land because it hasn't gone through processing. It hasn't. It's that's allowed. But this is that's a land application of the dairy processing waste. That's handled by A&R.
So that wouldn't be something that's regulated under the RAPS.
No, it's not. Dairy processing technically is not farming unless you somehow qualify because you're principally producing on your farm.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Moving on from there, you move out of the definitions which are related to all A&R water programs, and instead and then you move into a subchapter just based on CAFOs. It's still in the water resources chapter, but it's only about CAFOs. The important one is AFO. What is an AFO? Ladder facility, animals, 45 days or more, crops, vegetation, or forage is denuded in the area. 2 or more individual adjoining farms with common ownership are going to be considered a single AFO. So that's because you need to be an AFO in order to be a CAFO, and you only need a permit if you're a CAFO. Then you get the definition of large CAFO, the reverse nose arc, and then later on in the bill, you will see when they would be required to get a permit. And that is if they have an actual discharge, a discharge that originates outside of the facility and passes through or comes in contact with animals, or there is a violation of your nutrient management plan. Manure, medium CAFO, again, reverse nose arcing, but you see the discharge standards here. For the medium, you're not going to require a medium farm to get a CAFO permit unless they're discharging or they're having the ones that originate outside and pass over and come in contact with the animal. Then I think you can basically, small CAFO, that's going to be according to the criteria later in the bill, when the secretary determines that the small AFO is a significant contributor of pollutants to waters of the state, and is then required to get a CAFO permit. And then you get the powers of the secretary.
Representative Nelson.
Sorry, I have to ask this question. You have a big production area. Your cows are housed in the barn. No cattle outside. You have a big rain event. Water comes down off the hill above the farm and runs down through the driveways and whatnot where you have truck traffic and tractor traffic and whatnot, but no cattle. Is that a discharge or is that not a discharge? And it continues on, you know.
It goes into a water of the state.
And yeah, well, yeah, in our case it doesn't, but if it did, if it, in other case it went down off and.
I could argue that either way. Because it's a rain event. But it's also the introduction of waste into a water directly from the production area, which is a point source.
That's the way I've always understood it.
And so I think that they would say, regardless of where it originated from, because it came off of the production facility and assuming it picked up waste, that it was going to be considered a point source discharge.
Okay.
Because right there on page 23, line 6, you'll see that the concentrated animal feeding operation is the same thing as a ditch. Moving
That page 23, line 3, line.
line 6. So moving on from there, you get the powers of the secretary. There's some pretty important things to remember here. They can designate page 25, line 12, they can designate any AFO that meets the definition of a CAFO as a CAFO. And that means you get a permit. They can require any AFO to obtain a CAFO permit upon a determination that the AFO is discharging to waters of the state. So small, medium, large, they can require you to get a CAFO permit whenever they determine you are discharging to waters of the state. It can designate any small AFO as a CAFO if after on-site inspection, they determine the AFO is discharging into a water and is a significant contributor of pollutants. But there's some factors that they're going to look at. They're going to look at the size of the AFO, the amount of waste reaching the waters, the location, means of conveyance, site conditions, soil, vegetation, rainfall. So not every small AFO may require a CAFO permit, even if there's a discharge. And that's based on the federal law.
But the secretary, A&R secretary had some discretion.
For the small.
Yeah.
They can access private property for inspection. And then you get to the CAFO permit requirement, the discharge, manure, litter, or processed wastewater to waters of the state from a permitted CAFO. As a result of the application of that manure to land areas is a discharge, except where it is an agricultural stormwater discharge. And that's following the language of the Clean Water Act regulations. And then for purposes of the subsection where manure, litter, or processed wastewater has been applied in accordance with the federal regulations, that precipitation-related discharge is going to be considered an ag stormwater discharge, which means it's exempt.
So how does Representative Nelson's earlier question then tie into this situation, a rain event?
Because he wasn't talking about the discharge from land application of manure. He was talking about the rain event crossing through the production facility, originating outside, crossing through, picking up waste, and then going into the water of the state. This is about when you're out on your fields and you're land applying manure or nutrients or processed wastewater. When you are doing that, and you're doing it according to site-specific conditions, which means a nutrient management plan, and there is a rain event and it runs into water, that is not a discharge. And this language could be clearer, but this is the federal language. They basically use that. So for unpermitted large CAFOs, a precipitation-related discharge from land area under the control of the CAFO shall be considered an exempt only where it has been land applied in accordance with site-specific nutrient management practices that ensure appropriate ag utilization of the nutrients and the manure, litter, or processed wastewater as determined by the secretary. If you have your 590 plan, NRCS 590 plan, your nutrient management plan, your consultant, certified consultant issuing the plan, that will be sufficient, and you're following it, You have to maintain your documentation of the nutrient management plan site or at a nearby office. The presumption that exists today that farms in compliance with the RAPs are not discharging does not apply to any AFO determined to be a CAFO. Which makes sense. You can't be presumed not to be discharging when you have to get a permit because you are discharging. Then there's the community stakeholder group, December 1st, 2025. So the end of this year, they will, after coordination with ag, shall do all of the public outreach and collection of notice and comment that they're required to do on all of these specific subjects. And then they report back to you February 15th, 2026. So you said that there was a timing issue?
So the witness suggested that the stakeholder groups work product would be coming after, or noted that would be coming after the new MOU was due, which is September, and wondered whether it would make sense to have the two dates reversed or change one of them so that the MOU, the new MOU, comes after the stakeholder group had a chance to weigh in. So I think there's a couple of considerations. One is that September 1st date for the new document, I think, is something that the EPA wanted to see.
That's my understanding. You could probably request from the agencies an extension of that, but I can't speak to how the EPA would respond.
So then maybe we could just look at the language that's here saying what it is that the stakeholder group is being asked to do and whether that in fact aligns with what's going to be needed in the new MOU. Maybe they're not thoroughly.
I mean, there is overlap. Partly one of the things that they're going to look at is page 29, how to best create regulatory clarity for ag producers for the long term, including whether within a two-agency regulatory system, a full transfer of regulatory authority to A&R. So the document defines the roles and responsibilities of both agencies. So if there's a two-agency regulatory process, well, that makes sense. But if there's only a one agency regulatory process, you don't need the document.
Hmm.
And that, whether they recommend that one regulatory entity model informs the resources, technical assistance, and reg structure, which also informs the document. So there's definitely overlap.
And if we were not to change the timing here, just leave this as is, the document is produced, EPA takes a look at it, signs off on it perhaps. The work group then gets together, the stakeholder group comes up with what they've been asked to come up with. Is there still an opportunity to then go back and revise the document?
I think there's opportunity for future legislation, and I believe I've said it in here. I think you're going to be amending these statutes of piecemeal over the next couple of years. And everything that you do will be subject to EPA scrutiny. So if you want to go through the stakeholder process and then make changes, you can, but you're just going to have to undergo EPA scrutiny for anything that you propose.
William Nelson.
Some of the discussions have been having with dairy farmers on this process is, they look at the rules New York has, and they look at the rules Vermont has, and they talk about new technologies. So the stakeholder group will be like looking at new technology, like when the rats were set, no one was injecting manure.
Right.
No one was,
Well, they were, but then when they did the performance, the manure was like shooting out all over the place.
yeah. So better now than.
I went to one of those. It was awesome.
Anyway, the process has gotten better.
Right.
So they want to look at things like, and up in my world, it won't matter much or where Heather is, because we're in perpetual winter for 12 months, 10 months a year. But the Connecticut River Valley or Champlain Valley or,
Yeah.
where they have weeks of pour skidooing and the rest of the time it's open ground, is there an opportunity for them to inject manure and put it on safely? And so these are what the stakeholder groups are for.
So, does anybody feel strongly that we should change what's in this draft to affect the timing of the stakeholder? Okay, I'm going to suggest then that we leave that.
I would just say if you made the stakeholder group report back to September 1st, you're not going to get
Yeah,
that report back.
stakeholder group will be doing other things.
Yeah. So then you get to, this is an amendment to the kind of umbrella discharge authority of the Agency of Natural Resources. And it's being amended because there's an exemption from a discharge permit for complying with the RAPs. As you saw earlier, that you don't get that exemption if you're required to get the CAFO permit. So if you're not required to get the VIPTES permit, then you get the exemption. And that applies to silvicultural practices as well when you're complying with the AMPs.
Can you explain what VIPTES is?
So the federal government, their permitting system is called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NIPTES.
Yeah.
And when it was implemented in Vermont and delegated to Vermont, they defined it as the Vermont Pollution Discharge Elimination System, VIPTES. And so technically what permits that ANR issues are not NIPTES permits, they're VIPTES permits. And we went back and forth. I went back and forth with the agency. What do you want to call them? VIPTES or NIPTES? And they decided that they're going to call them VIPTES.
Discharge
Discharge Elimination System. Um, So moving on, then you get a lot of the stuff you've already seen for the Agency of Agriculture and their MOU. You get those changes to the MOU for A and R because they have the same language in the two different programs. So the MOU is gone, it's replaced by the document. It has to set forth the concurrent authority, the roles and responsibilities of each, how they're going to cooperate. EPA has to be involved in issuing the document. The document replaces the MOU. It's subject to public notice and comment. And that's basically what that section is. And then you get to another one of A&R's discharge permit sections, and you'll see any person who intends to discharge has to get a permit or is required to apply for a CAFO permit shall make the application to A&R for a discharge permit. And it's just adding the CAFO permit underneath this just general discharge authority. And then again, it's the MOU language being struck. Oh, actually, no, this isn't the MOU language. This is the language that requires a general permit. There was previously a requirement that or authority for A&R to issue an individual permit or a general permit. This is requiring them to issue a general permit and notice of intent letter. This is we discussed yesterday, instead of requiring A&R to process individual permits for, I don't know, 100 farms. They issue one permit, sets out all the conditions and criteria that all farms need to follow, and then the farms issue a notice of intent to follow it. But they may direct the farm to apply for an individual permit if there are issues with that farm. And then a large farm will not be required to have the CAFO permit unless there's waste discharge to water, waste originate outside, pass through, go into a water, or that precipitation related event that was not in accordance with site-specific nutrient management practices. Secretary shall require a nutrient management plan for all CAFOs, which is required under the CAFO, federal CAFO rules. And once a CAFO is covered under a CAFO permit, it's got a 5-year duration, which means that they have to apply every 5 years for a new permit. And every 5 years, they can be subject to new terms, like new conditions, requirements, criteria. You don't vest in the law as it exists today in perpetuity. You may have to adjust to the law as it is evolving. Section 12 is amending the exemption for farms from the stormwater permit requirement. This provides currently stormwater runoff from farms doesn't need a stormwater permit if it's complying with the RAPS. But this provides stormwater runoff from farms in compliance with the RAPS and not subject to the Federal Clean Water Act. So meaning it doesn't require a CAFO permit. That is exempt from a stormwater permit. The same thing for silvicultural. If you're determined not to require the Federal Clean Water Act for silvicultural, then you are exempt from stormwater permitting. And that's the last.
That's that. Thanks. All right, Michelle.
Chair Durfee,
Yes.
is this favorable or favorable with amendment? Oh, we're
I'm
amending.
not quite sure we're there yet, but it will be with amendment, yes, because we've made a couple of changes, even just those two preferences to,
Subdivision.
it would make an amendment. So are we at a point where we would be comfortable voting this out? It will go to, so there's a fee, there's references to fees in here. We talked about that yesterday. It has to go to Ways and Means. It will also go to the Environment Committee to have a look at, and it won't be on the floor, in other words. Maybe next week. I don't know. Be a few days.
Would I have to go, when it goes to environment, would I have to go down and present it to them or?
Yeah, I think
No.
I'm gonna put myself as the reporter, and then we can tag team on it.
Okay.
I think that they're probably pretty familiar with the bill because Ledge Council has been in there and we haven't really changed enough to, but we can certainly talk about it. Yeah. Give them our perspective on why we didn't change things too. So,
What draft number and what?
okay, so let's do that. I'm gonna request a motion to recommend the amendment draft number 1.1. What's up on the screen right now, Jed?
Yeah.
Any of that information down? The date?
But should the date be the 8th or the?
I use that date, yeah.
And it's and your committee's amendment, draft 1.1.
Yeah, so is there a motion? Read it again. Is there a motion? Could I have a motion, please, to recommend that the House amend the bill with draft number 1.1 dated 5/7/25 of S-124?
So moved.
Representative Morgan, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Great, thanks. Representative Burt. Any further discussion? All right, if you would call the roll.
Calling the roll on S-124, draft 1.1. As amended, dated 5/7/25. Rep Bosley, how do you
Yes.
vote?
Yes.
Rep Morgan.
Yes.
Nelson.
Yes.
Rep Brian is absent. Rep Supernaw.
Yes.
Rep Durfee.
Yes.
Vote tally is 7 yes, 0 no, 1 absent.
All right, thank you.
And shall I put you
Yeah,
as reporter?
yeah, and then I'll take care of the paperwork today and we can touch base. Mike, thank you. We're all set. Are you available at all tomorrow? If we finish the floor for lunch?
I have a weird feeling I'm in here tomorrow.
Okay.
It just says community
Maybe after lunch.
discussion on the schedule I have all day, but you might have dated stuff.
Yeah, I'm in here at 1.
Okay. Are you somewhere else in the morning if we?
I'm in Senate Natural from 9 until 11, and I'm in Senate Ag at 11:30. They're taking their vote on H-484, the House miscellaneous ag bill.
Okay, so no, tomorrow, okay, good. So then, when, I don't know what the floor is gonna look like tomorrow, but we'll have, let's come back here, we can chat more about S-45, and then when Mike's here in the afternoon, I don't want to keep people too long, but we might have time to talk about some language tomorrow afternoon,
Or,
S-45.
okay,
The devotional might take a while tomorrow.
That's right, must see TV, right? At
Yeah.
5:30 tomorrow.
If you think